It was supposed to be a routine diplomatic photo opportunity. Two presidents, a polished conference room, cameras rolling. But Ibrahim Traoré did something no African leader had dared to do in 60 years of post-colonial diplomacy. Emmanuel Macron was mid-sentence, gesturing toward what he called a renewed partnership framework, when the 36-year-old captain from Burkina Faso closed his folder, pushed back his chair, and stood up. Not in anger, not in confusion, with absolute rehearsed calm. He buttoned his military jacket, looked Macron directly in the eyes, and said 5 words that would detonate across 3 continents before the sun set that evening. 5 words that made France do something it almost never does: retreat. But here is what no one reported. Well, what Traoré said after he left that room was far more dangerous than the walkout itself and the chain of events it triggered. France didn't just recall their ambassador, they scrambled. Because Traoré had been preparing for this moment for months, and Macron had no idea he had already lost before the meeting even started. To understand why this single act of defiance rearranged the power structure of an entire region, you have to understand what Burkina Faso was before Ibrahim Traoré entered the picture. And more importantly, you have to understand what France had been doing there for decades, quietly, strategically, and without accountability. Burkina Faso sits in the heart of West Africa, landlocked, surrounded by 6 countries, rich in gold, manganese, and uranium. For over 60 years after independence, France maintained what political analysts call France-Afrique, a shadow system of economic and military control over its former colonies that never truly ended when the flags changed. The CFA franc, a currency pegged to the French treasury, meant that 14 African nations effectively handed over monetary sovereignty to Paris. French military bases dotted the Sahel like watchtowers. French corporations extracted minerals under agreements negotiated not with the people of Burkina Faso, but with leaders France helped place and helped keep in power. And whenever someone challenged this arrangement, they disappeared. Thomas Sankara, the revolutionary president of Burkina Faso in the 1980s, tried to break free. He rejected foreign aid dependency, launched mass literacy and vaccination campaigns, redistributed land, and told France publicly that debt was a tool of recolonization. In 1987, Sankara was assassinated in a coup led by his own deputy, Blaise Compaoré, a man who would go on to rule for 27 years with French backing. Compaoré's first international phone call after seizing power was to Paris. That tells you everything. For decades after Sankara's murder, the message was clear: defy France, and you will be erased. Every leader in Francophone Africa understood the rules. Smile at the summit, sign the agreements, keep the military bases open, let the resources flow outward, and in return, you get to stay alive and stay in power. Ibrahim Traoré grew up in that system. He was born in 1988, 1 year after Sankara was killed. He studied geology at the University of Ouagadougou. He joined the military. And he rose through the ranks not through political connections, but through competence in a theater of war. By his early 30s, Traoré was commanding troops in the fight against jihadist insurgents in the northern provinces, groups that had overrun large sections of the country while the French-backed government in Ouagadougou did almost nothing effective to stop them. French forces under Operation Barkhane were supposedly there to fight terrorism, but Burkinabe soldiers on the ground watched as attacks continued, territory shrank, and French troops seemed more interested in protecting mining corridors than civilian populations. In September 2022, a group of young military officers led by Traoré overthrew the transitional government of Paul-Henri Sandaogo Damiba, who had himself taken power in a coup just 8 months earlier. Damiba had promised change, but delivered continuity. He maintained the French military presence. He kept the same economic agreements. The jihadist crisis worsened. So Traoré moved, and when he addressed the nation for the first time, he didn't speak like a general seizing power. He spoke like a son of Sankara, invoking sovereignty, dignity, and the right of Burkina Faso to determine its own future. Now, Paris had dealt with coups in Africa before. The playbook was simple: condemn the coup publicly, apply quiet pressure through financial channels, negotiate with the new leader privately, offer incentives to maintain the status quo. Within months, the new leader would be wearing the same suit as the old one, signing the same deals, hosting the same French ambassador, but Traoré didn't follow the script. Within weeks of taking power, He began doing things that made the Élysée Palace deeply uncomfortable. He demanded a full accounting of French military operations on Burkinabe soil. He questioned why French intelligence had failed to prevent attacks that killed hundreds of civilians. He ordered a review of every mining concession held by French companies. And then he did something that sent a signal no one in Paris could misinterpret. He began conversations with Russia, not because Traoré was ideologically aligned with Moscow. He was strategic. He understood leverage. France's greatest fear in the Sahel was not terrorism, not instability. It was irrelevance. The moment an African leader demonstrated that there were other partners available, other security arrangements possible, other buyers for gold and uranium, France's entire position weakened. Traoré didn't need to sign a deal with Russia. He just needed France to know he could. And this is where the confrontation that shook the diplomatic world began to take shape. Macron, facing domestic criticism over France's declining influence in Africa and the embarrassing withdrawal from Mali, where a similar military government had expelled French forces, decided to attempt a direct engagement with Traoré. The idea was classic Macron. Bold, theatrical, designed for the cameras, he would meet Traoré on the margins of an international summit, demonstrate that France could still engage as an equal partner, and publicly reset the relationship. Macron's advisors reportedly told him that Traoré was young, inexperienced, and could be managed. They were catastrophically wrong. The meeting was arranged. The setting was neutral ground, a conference facility during a multilateral summit. Cameras were positioned, statements were prepared. Macron arrived with his usual entourage, senior diplomats, Africa advisors, communications staff ready to broadcast the moment as a triumph of French diplomacy. Traoré arrived with 2 aides, no communications team, no prepared statement for the press. That alone should have told Macron something. The meeting began with Macron speaking first. He outlined what he called a new chapter in Franco-Burkinabe relations. He spoke of shared history, a phrase that made Traoré's jaw visibly tighten because in Burkina Faso, shared history means colonization, exploitation, and Sankara's murder. Macron proposed a restructured military cooperation agreement. He mentioned economic development funds. Yet he used the phrase mutual respect 3 times in 4 minutes. And then something happened that no one in that room expected. Traoré closed his folder. He didn't slam it. He didn't throw it. He placed his pen on top of it, aligned it carefully, and stood up. The room went silent. Macron stopped mid-sentence, his hand still raised in a gesture that suddenly looked foolish, frozen in the air. Traoré's 2 aides stood with him, perfectly synchronized, as if this had been rehearsed. Because it had been. Traoré looked at Macron and said clearly, so every microphone in the room captured it, "Burkina Faso is no longer available." Then he turned and walked out. Not quickly, not dramatically, with the measured pace of a man who had already decided exactly how many steps it would take to reach the door, and exactly what that silence would sound like filling the room behind him. The French delegation sat frozen. Macron's lead Africa advisor later described the moment privately as the longest 15 seconds of my career. But what happened next is what truly mattered. And this is the part that most accounts of this confrontation get wrong or leave out entirely. Traoré did not go to his hotel. He did not call a press conference. He walked directly to a separate meeting room where 3 other African heads of state were waiting, leaders from Mali, Niger, and Guinea, all nations that had recently undergone similar political transitions, all nations chafing under French influence. This meeting had been arranged weeks in advance. The walkout on Macron was not an emotional outburst. It was the opening move in a coordinated strategy. And now ask yourself, if you were an advisor to Macron and you learned within the hour that Traoré had walked out of your meeting and directly into a room with 3 other leaders who collectively controlled a significant portion of West Africa's territory, population, and natural resources, what would you do? What could you do? In that second meeting, Traoré reportedly laid out a framework for what would become the Alliance of Sahel States, a mutual defense and economic cooperation pact that explicitly excluded France. The agreement included provisions for shared military intelligence, coordinated border security, and most critically, a joint negotiating position on resource extraction contracts. No longer would France, or any outside power, be able to play these nations against each other, but offering slightly better terms to one while exploiting another. They would negotiate as a bloc. Traoré also raised something that made the other leaders lean forward. He proposed a timeline for exiting the CFA franc. Not immediately, he was too strategic for that. He understood that monetary transition required preparation, reserve accumulation, and trade agreements with alternative partners. But he proposed a working group, a roadmap, a date. The currency that had chained Francophone Africa to French monetary policy for over 6 decades was for the first time being discussed not as an immovable reality, but as a problem with a deadline. When word of this second meeting reached Paris, and it reached Paris fast because French intelligence had assets at the summit, the reaction was immediate and severe. Within 48 hours, the French Foreign Ministry issued a statement announcing the recall of its ambassador to Burkina Faso for consultations. In diplomatic language, recalling an ambassador is one step below severing relations entirely. It is a statement of profound displeasure, a signal that the relationship has fundamentally broken down. But here is what made Traoré's strategy so devastating. He had anticipated the recall. He wanted it because the moment France recalled its ambassador, it confirmed to every watching African nation exactly what Traoré had been saying. That France viewed these countries not as sovereign partners, but as subordinates who needed to be punished for disobedience. The recall was supposed to be pressure. Traoré turned it into proof. Within days, protests erupted across West Africa, not against Traoré, but against France. And in Bamako, Niamey, Ouagadougou, and Conakry, thousands marched carrying signs that read "France dégage," "France get out." Social media across the continent exploded. Traoré's walkout was replayed millions of times, analyzed, celebrated, and turned into a symbol. Young Africans who had never heard of Sankara were suddenly reading about him because Traoré had invoked his legacy. The walkout became more than a diplomatic incident. It became a generational moment. And Macron was trapped. If he escalated further, sanctions, asset freezes, military posturing, he would confirm the narrative of French neo-colonialism and accelerate the very thing he was trying to prevent. If he backed down, he would look weak domestically at a time when his political position was already fragile. He chose a middle path that satisfied no one. France issued carefully worded statements about respecting sovereignty while maintaining concerns about democratic governance. Translation: we have no good options. Meanwhile, Traoré was already implementing the next phase. He formally requested the withdrawal of all remaining French military personnel from Burkina Faso. He gave them a deadline, not an open-ended negotiation, a deadline. French forces, some of whom had been stationed in the country for over a decade, began packing within weeks. Traoré replaced them not with Russian mercenaries, as Western media breathlessly predicted, but with a reorganized national military supplemented by intelligence sharing agreements with multiple international partners. He diversified. He refused to trade one dependency for another. On the economic front, Traoré's government renegotiated gold mining contracts that had for years sent the vast majority of profits overseas. New terms required higher royalty payments, mandatory local processing of a percentage of extracted ore, and Burkinabe ownership stakes in mining operations. Foreign companies that refused the new terms were told they were free to leave. Most stayed because the gold was too valuable to abandon, and they knew that if they left, Chinese, Turkish, or Russian firms would take their place within months. But Traoré's most significant move was one that received almost no international media coverage. And this is something I want you to think about. He launched an agricultural sovereignty program. Burkina Faso, despite having arable land, had been importing a shocking percentage of its food, much of it from European suppliers, and at prices that kept local farmers uncompetitive. Traoré redirected military logistics infrastructure to support domestic food distribution. He imposed tariffs on imported goods that could be produced locally. He partnered with agronomists from Brazil and India, countries that had achieved their own agricultural revolutions, rather than relying on European development agencies that came with strings attached. Why does this matter? Because the most dangerous form of control is not military. It is not even monetary. It is nutritional. A nation that cannot feed itself can never truly be free. Traoré understood this in a way that revealed the depth of his strategic thinking. He was not just fighting France. He was dismantling every mechanism of dependency one by one systematically, and with the patience of a man who knew that true sovereignty is not declared in a single speech, but built across a generation. The international response split along predictable lines. Western governments expressed concern about democratic backsliding, a phrase they never seemed to use when France-backed autocrats were in charge. The African Union issued measured statements. But across the continent, among ordinary citizens, Traoré's approval was extraordinary. He had done what decades of summit speeches, UN resolutions, and academic conferences had failed to do. He had demonstrated in a single visible act followed by concrete policy that an African leader could say no to a former colonial power and not only survive, but emerge stronger. And that is the part that scared Paris most. Not the walkout, not the ambassador recall, or not the military withdrawal. It was the demonstration effect. If Burkina Faso could do it, so could Senegal, so could Côte d'Ivoire, so could Cameroon. The entire edifice of France-Afrique, maintained for 60 years through a combination of economic manipulation, military presence, and the careful cultivation of compliant leaders, was suddenly vulnerable. Not to an army, not to an ideology, but to an example. Traoré returned to Ouagadougou after the summit, to crowds that lined the road from the airport. He did not give a triumphant speech. He went to the presidential office and held a cabinet meeting about grain storage capacity. That detail, reported almost as an afterthought by local media, tells you more about Ibrahim Traoré than any dramatic account of the walkout ever could. He was not performing revolution. He was governing. As of now, Burkina Faso remains under enormous pressure. Jihadist threats persist in the north. Economic challenges are real and serious. The transition to full civilian governance remains a subject of debate. Traoré has not claimed that the struggle is over, and he would be the first to say that sovereignty is not won in a single moment, but defended every single day. But here is what is undeniable. A 36-year-old captain from a landlocked West African nation walked out on the president of France, told him his country was no longer available for exploitation, and then methodically followed through with policies that made those words real. France recalled their ambassador. French troops left. Mining contracts were rewritten. A regional alliance was formed, and the CFA franc, for the first time in its history, it was placed on a timeline for replacement. Not through luck, not through foreign sponsorship, not through chaos, through preparation, conviction, and the kind of strategic intelligence that turns a 15-second walkout into a geopolitical earthquake. They told him he was too young. They told him he didn't understand how the world works. They told him that small countries don't get to say no to great powers. He closed his folder, stood up, buttoned his jacket, and proved every single one of them wrong. Burkina Faso is no longer available, and the world heard it.